So today we have three speakers from the School District of Philadelphia and Temple University, Dr. Era McCorson, Dr. Elizabeth Fernero, and Dr. Gabriella McLaughlin. They will be presenting on the key determinants of school breakfast program implementation in the Philadelphia public schools and the implications of the role of SNAP-Ed. So with that, I will turn it over to you ladies.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm, as Camille said, I'm Erin McCrossan. I'm a senior research associate at the School District of Philadelphia, and I'm here with my colleague, Liz Fernero, who also works at the school district, as well as our wonderful friend from Temple University, Gabriella McLaughlin, who's an assistant professor. So we wanted to share today about some research that we conducted at the school district that was recently published in Frontiers in Public Health, which we can share the link to that journal article at the end. It is open access. So we're going to talk a little bit about our research study, the background and methods, as well as our findings, implications for policy, as well as practice and research. And then we'll open it up for questions and discussion from all of you. All right, so I'll just turn it over to Dr. McLaughlin.
All right, I'm just going to dump the paper into the chat so folks can see it as well if they want to read along. So this kind of line of research has come about because we have policies in place, we have funding in place, we have the beautiful SNAP-Ed program in place. What we don't know is what happens when we implement a policy or a program and some of the key issues that are kind of underpinning if that policy or program is successful. And so my work kind of focuses on some of the implementation science aspects of these policies to help people like Erin and Liz and all the folks in SNAP-Ed do their job and actually understand why the results are coming across the way they are. And so one of the challenges that we're seeing, particularly in urban districts, is low uptake of breakfast and lunch programming in schools. In fact, FRAC just came out with a report and they noted a significant decline in participation in schools regarding school meal programs, which is a real problem, especially with food security, but also overarching issues like school finances are heavily dependent on these numbers that we get. And so it's not only an issue for improving student food security, but it's also a massive school culture issue as well that we have to work through. And so I was graciously asked to help really kind of tie some of the finishing pieces up of the research that Erin and Liz conducted and led over the last couple of years to understand determinants of implementing two different school breakfast programs in the district, and then ways in which we can try to improve those so we can get wider adoption. Next slide, please. So just to kind of go through some definitions, there's 4 different models here. There's cafeteria before the bell, which is basically what I think most of us have kind of started out with implementing or being used to. There is a grab and go cart where breakfast is available on a cart in the hallway before or after the bell. Breakfast in the classroom, which is on the box something, says in the classroom so students eat together again after the bell. And then cafeteria after the bell, which is where there's like a second chance breakfast where students who are coming just after the bell starts can still get that access to breakfast. Next slide, please. And so our main questions were, what are the positive determinants to breakfast implementation? What are some of the negative determinants or challenges that we're seeing in model implementation? And then what are the pragmatic ways that schools can implement to mitigate these issues and increase that reach of breakfast programming? Next slide. So this was conducted predominantly with qualitative methods, but one of the nice ways that, and again, I'll let Erin and Liz go through some of the actual survey design methodology pieces here, but what we're able to do is understand not only overall challenges and overall support, but by model of implementation. And the 2 main models that we focused on were breakfast in the classroom and cafeteria after the bell, predominantly because these are the 2 methods that allow schools to serve breakfast beyond that initial scheduled time before the school day starts. And again, these are what we know is most challenging to implement and what oftentimes administrators and school food service directors have the hardest time with getting people on board to actually implement. So surveys were given out to principals and lead kitchen staff, and they also led interviews with principals, kitchen staff, classroom teachers, and actually a quite rarity, climate staff, which is not always an included piece of these kinds of studies. And then finally, one of the greatest things that the Office of Research Evaluation can do is really conduct observations to collect that rich data as and when these meals are being served, to understand some of these contextual, nuanced determinants that you don't always get through surveys and interviews. Next slide. And so these data are analysed using frequency analysis. And so overall, we had 38 principals respond to the survey, which, if you know anything about trying to get hold of the principal, is actually a pretty good number. And then 145 lead kitchen staff survey responses, which is again a massive win. And they did observations and 14 observations and 10 interviews. And so in the next couple of slides, I'll just walk you through the framework that we use to try to analyze these data and present overarching themes before I pass it off. The next slide for me. Oh, I'm sorry. The last piece I'll just talk about is for the observations that we use. We had 4 different sites. We had an elementary school, a high school, and then at the bottom here, we have 2 more elementary schools. And as you can see, the breakfast model change was different depending on each school. So that really gave the research team a varied sample from which to conduct observations. So as you can see here, for instance, site number 3 had school-wide breakfast in the classroom, whereas number 4 had kind of piecemeal together with cafeteria after the bell, and then some with breakfast in the classroom due to space constraints. So again, a lot of these are not cut and dried depending on what model they're implementing. And oftentimes we'll see that schools are chopping and changing depending on the schedule or other issues that are happening throughout the school year, which means they cannot always consistently give one model of implementation. And sometimes that allows for kind of this nice variation that we see, particularly with this study. Next slide, please. Okay, so here's the piece that I was building up to, apologies. So the framework for implementation research, basically, this model was developed by some colleagues who worked at the VA up in the University of Michigan. And it was a large undertaking to basically scour the field of all of the implementation research that was happening in the 1990s, 2000s and beyond, to try and conceptualize what were the main factors that we need to be looking at when we understand what implementation is. So you're doing implementation research in any kind of organizational setting. The 5 key domains that we keep seeing consistently in the literature that we need to be looking at as ways to understand how or why something worked are innovation characteristics. So again, what is the actual thing, the policy, the program that you're trying to implement? The outer setting, which are things outside that particular implementation context. So in our case, it would be that context is one school, right? But then the outer setting is the district and also the city of Philadelphia. Inner setting is again issues within the school, school leadership, readiness for implementation, what's the culture of that school like, and then characteristics of individuals. So who are the staff leading this implementation effort? How motivated are they? What's the cohesion among those staff? What's their level of experience, etc. And then finally, the implementation process. So what are the things that are happening to get your policy implemented according to plan? What are your processes? Are you engaging the right people to be in that conversation and help lead this implementation effort? And again, these are all key considerations that help us to understand why or why not something is working. And then on this second slide, it hopefully gives you a little bit of a visualization model. And this is often how we explain it to our research partners. Oh, sorry, next slide, please, mind. Thank you. So that it kind of helps you visualize it a bit more. So if you can imagine that what we were able to do is take the data from the interviews, data from observations and the surveys, and start to group them into not only supports and challenges, but also where are they sitting in the overall school context. So if you can imagine this centerpiece where we have the individuals involved, what were the certain barriers or supports that were cited by participants that related to our school meal staff, right? Who is implementing these programs and who potentially could be actually in the way or preventing these programs from being effective implement effectively, excuse me. And then we have the inner setting, which again applies to the whole of the school environment. What is it about that setting? Is there enough space to do this? Is there enough resources, staffing, etc., to get our breakfast models implemented according to plan? And so again, as you can see with all of these constructs, we were able to start to group these themes by domain of the school context to help us understand which components of the school setting and context were actually going to be driving implementation and what were most important for us to consider as we try and work with these schools to improve implementation. So I'm going to just stop there and kind of let Erin and Liz kind of finish out with the rest of the methods. And then when you see the results, you hopefully kind of see how this kind of comes together and why it was important for us to map these data back onto these constructs. So over to you, Erin.
Hi, so I'm going to take over and I'm going to talk about our findings. So our findings really highlighted the successes and challenges to breakfast implementation, and I'm going to start with an overview of stakeholder needs to help us understand what principals consider when choosing an after the bell model. And then I'm going to share key challenges to breakfast implementation. And then after, I'll hand it over to Erin, who will provide an overview of key facilitators to breakfast implementation. So this slide provides an overview of principal perception of the relative advantage of school breakfast models, and it focuses on after the bell models. So breakfast in the classroom, which we abbreviate as BIC, grab and go cart served after the bell, or cafeteria after the bell, which we abbreviate as CAB. So principals were asked on the surveys to identify which predetermined factors were most important for choosing their after the bell breakfast model. And the figure on the left shows principal responses to a question asking them how important were the following factors in their school's decision to have one of the three after the bell models. It shows those factors such as increasing breakfast participation numbers and making sure students have enough to eat, and the percentage of principals at schools with different after the bell breakfast models who ranked that factor as not at all important, slightly important, somewhat important, or extremely important. And you see that principals' responses were broadly similar across the different breakfast models. But overall, there were two factors that stood out as most important, and those were making sure students have enough to eat and making sure students have access to healthy foods. Considering only responses from schools with BIC and CAB, principals then placed high importance on ensuring students have access to enough healthy breakfast foods. Additionally, there were some differences between BIC and CAB responses. Principals at schools with BIC emphasized increasing participation numbers and helping students learn better, while principals at schools with CAB emphasized attendance. Next slide, please. So this slide looks similar, but it's showing principal reported negative implementation determinants according to breakfast model. And this includes breakfast in the classroom, grab and go carts, cafeteria after the bell, and then also cafeteria before the bell. So this is looking at serving breakfast before school starts and after using various models. So principals again were asked on the survey to rate predetermined implementation factors as challenges. The figure on the left here shows the percentage of principals with each breakfast model that rated each factor as a great challenge, moderate challenge, a slight challenge, or not a challenge. And you can see that getting students to come early was perceived as a significant challenge for schools with cafeteria before the bell. So while breakfast is served before school, it's there and ready for students to enjoy it. It's difficult to get students to come early because of transportation challenges or the challenges associated with having to get up even earlier to come to school. And schools implementing cafeteria after the bell reported greater challenges related to missed learning time because students are eating breakfast after school starts, they're missing instructional time. For most common factors, such as messes, pests, and extra work for teachers and custodial staff, cafeteria after the bell schools had much larger percentages of principals reporting not a challenge than breakfast in the classroom schools. So in other words, BIC was consistently rated as more challenging overall, while CAB was described as challenging only in some school contexts. And next slide, please. This slide is also showing negative implementation determinants, but it's looking at differences in responses from principals and lead kitchen staff at schools that are serving breakfast in the classroom. So the figure on the left shows responses from principals and lead kitchen staff at schools that served breakfast in the classroom at the time of the survey, to a question asking them to what extent certain factors were challenges in their school. So at the surveyed schools, and again, these are just schools that are operating breakfast in the classroom, lead kitchen staff were more likely than principals to identify messes, pests, such as rodents and insects, and extra work for teachers and staff as great challenges. Other challenges, including food waste and student behavior, were also considered slightly more challenging by lead kitchen staff. And next slide, thanks. So data from observations and interviews also show that cleanliness, pests, and messes were a challenge related to serving breakfast in the classroom. The data from principal survey responses discussed previously confirm this finding. For instance, the research team observed teachers and students sweeping up crumbs after BIC and one student cleaning up spilled milk in the classroom. And in addition, during observations of breakfast in the classroom, students had to leave the classroom to empty unused milk or juice into bathroom sinks. And in a lot of cases, there weren't sinks in the classroom. And as an additional example, during an interview, a school administrator cited mice as one reason for transitioning from breakfast in the classroom to the cafeteria after the bell model. So overall, messes are inevitable, but serving cafeteria after the bell limits those breakfast messes to one space. A teacher at one school site, which served breakfast in the classroom school-wide, confirmed that cleaning up the classroom after breakfast was a challenge. They said, "I like the fact that kids may not be able to eat at home. I like the fact that kids that may not be able to get to eat at home are able to eat, but the cleanup is a lot." A lack of communication, coordination, and consistency between school staff and kitchen staff was also a challenge to implementation. Survey data shows that kitchen staff and school staff experienced breakfast models differently. Principals gave the highest overall favorability rating to breakfast in the classroom, while lead kitchen staff gave the highest favorability rating to cafeteria after the bell. Communication between kitchen staff and school staff can also be a challenge to successful breakfast implementation. And also kitchen staff challenges such as staff turnover impeded the consistency of breakfast delivery. For example, one school had several kitchen managers in one year, resulting in changes to procedures, which were stressful for school staff. This quote from a principal emphasizes that while school and kitchen staff have a common goal, communication can be a challenge. This principal, whose school served breakfast in the classroom school-wide, expressed that the logistics of getting the breakfast crates to the classrooms, cleanup once the crates are returned, and recording breakfast participation requires communication about procedures. They said, "We all see the value and the need to make sure that our students are well fed, especially that starts with a really nutritious breakfast to start off the day. Any frustrations that come across usually come with procedural and lack of clarity." And next we have a quote from a lead kitchen staff, which exemplifies how inconsistent kitchen staffing impeded schools' ability to implement alternative breakfast models. This lead kitchen staff member liked to serve fresh smoothies on a cart in the cafeteria, which was popular with students. However, when they didn't have a complete kitchen staff due to staff turnover, they were unable to do so. And they said, "Unfortunately, I'm out of a cook and sometimes I'm out of a worker. So that puts me behind the 8 ball. So I have to stay in the kitchen." Another challenge to successful breakfast implementation was divergent perspectives on the role of SNAP Ed in breakfast participation amongst stakeholders. SNAP Ed provides nutrition education, taste tests, and promotion, so students are more willing to try new foods. However, more technical assistance, collaboration, and buy-in is needed for classroom teachers, food service staff, and school leaders to try breakfast after the bell models and incorporate students' preferences. So during an interview, a teacher highlighted that breakfast promotion was made difficult for SNAP Ed because they were tasked with promoting meals when students didn't like all of the options. So this teacher said, kids, when they think of breakfast, in my opinion, they think of eggs and pancakes and waffles and cereal and oatmeal. They don't think of a piece of banana bread as breakfast. You can promote it all you want, but if it is something the kids don't like to eat, they're not going to eat it because someone tells them it's good for you. And so they're highlighting a tension between the work that SNAP Ed is doing and the food that the cafeteria is able to serve students. So now I'm going to hand it over to Erin, who's going to discuss some of the positive determinants to breakfast implementation.
Great, thanks, Liz. So overall, we found that cafeteria after the bell best addresses students and families' needs and is most feasible for schools. So while both breakfast in the classroom and cafeteria after the bell reduce barriers to students accessing school breakfast, like having to arrive early or stigma associated with eating school meals, overall cafeteria after the bell maximize participation while minimizing challenges. So one of the factors that was associated with this was that hot breakfast was easier and made possible with cafeteria after the bell, which was a clear preference for our students and school staff. We received a lot of comments about how only cold items are possible with breakfast in the classroom. And that leads to more highly processed and higher carbohydrate foods that are less fresh and were less popular with students. And that is because typically the cafeteria would prepare crates of foods that would then have to be transported up several flights of stairs. And so keeping hot foods hot, or even some cold foods cold at the right temperature that is safe to serve, was impossible. Cafeteria after the bell also limits cleanup to one space, as Liz described, which makes it easier for cafeteria and facility staff to clean up and reduces the need for intensive teacher and student cleaning, such as sweeping crumbs, leaving the classroom to dump excess milk, etc. And if pests are a problem in classrooms with breakfast in the classroom, cafeteria after the bell can reduce that burden as well. And again, just limiting those messes and the pests to one area only. What we observed when we looked at cafeteria after the bell is that classes can be served in shifts where teachers can help facilitate breakfast service. And we saw teachers using that time in really creative ways, integrating community building activities and learning activities that can then help address the lost instructional time, such as announcements, learning activities, or literacy games. We saw that in breakfast in the classrooms as well, but the same kind of model can be done in cafeteria after the bell. We also saw that cafeteria after the bell typically works well or better in elementary schools. So one school administrator was talking about how breakfast is really important to their families. And they said, we're in a high poverty school, a lot of working parents, a lot of grandparents raising their kids. A lot of kids' parents are getting off shift work and then bringing their kids to schools. A lot of homes can't actually afford adequate nutrition for their students. Therefore, a lot of times breakfast is skipped, or parents rely on breakfast as a way for their students to get food because what they're getting at home is infrequent and they don't have the time. It's not nutritious. At least when they come to school, they get that nutritious, well-balanced breakfast. And I think that speaks to some of the needs that our students and families are facing. School staff also described the benefits of, in particular, of classroom cafeteria after the bell models. So they said a lot of kids, they sit around the table, they're all eating together. I couldn't really tell you how it impacts the little kids. I just see the expressions on their faces and they sit there and they talk with their little friends and they're having a good meal. So it's pretty good. So I think this speaks to how cafeteria after the bell models can really increase the sense of community and really work really well for our elementary schools. Another positive determinant that we found was addressing student tastes. So providing hot meals and fresh fruit was really important. School and cafeteria staff noted that the breakfast meals that were most popular were hot breakfasts, such as egg sandwiches, and felt they should be served more often. Our observations also indicated that students really liked the fresh fruit, such as oranges, when they were served with breakfast. For example, in one observation, students actually cheered when their teacher looked in the crate and announced that there were oranges. We also saw, and we'll add, some disappointment sometimes because when there wasn't enough fresh fruit for all of the students were, walked away disappointed. And so that was another challenge. And so overall, we think that gaining student and parent input in decision-making menus is really important, and it's a positive determinant for increasing breakfast participation. So one teacher said, "I think your breakfast participation would go up twofold if we served stuff that the kids would enjoy eating." That's just my opinion. Like I said, I don't know if anyone believes the same as me, but I know even just around my school, you see it. Some breakfast the kids eat and some breakfast they don't eat. Another positive determinant that we found was entering the school through the cafeteria. And this works really well in high schools. So in high schools, typically an after the bell breakfast model cannot be provided. But physically changing the entrance that students use to come into the school, and sometimes that means even moving the metal detectors and the security procedures to the cafeteria, really worked well, because that way students have to pass by a free breakfast being offered and they have to opt out instead of having to opt in. All right, so now we're going to talk some about implications, and then we'll open it up for a conversation. So in terms of policy, one major success, I would say, at the School District of Philadelphia is that based on this research, we were able to include offering breakfast after the bell in our new strategic plan. So our district just hired a new superintendent last year who embarked on a strategic planning process. And based on our research and the data that our city faces a very high rate of poverty and food insecurity, we were able to include breakfast after the bell in that strategic plan. It's a big win. So still the details to work out, but it is a big win. As far as the teachers and administrators' concerns about the quality of food or the lack of high protein options that feel more filling to students in the morning, as well as fresh foods, I would say, we think that more advocacy is needed. The reimbursement amount received from USDA for breakfast is too low, which limits the procurement of high protein items like breakfast sandwiches, because those are more expensive and the preparation requirements for those foods are greater. And I would add fresh food in that as well. So we believe that an increased reimbursement amount for school breakfast and lunch would help increase higher value options served at breakfast. And again, that is a USDA policy where we need some advocacy. As far as implications for research, our findings reflect prior literature that shows there's a connection between serving breakfast after the bell and increasing meal participation, nutrition behaviors, and preventing absenteeism. Concerns about the quality of food and the lack of high protein options also reflect recent research with food service providers. Future research is needed that directly tests implementation strategies and key outcomes of reach and participation. So, for example, we need to address more often the question of how can schools bridge the policy to practice gap in school nutrition programs. Given the limitations regarding the meal reimbursements we just discussed, other limitations around building facilities and other realities, what are some of low-hanging fruit that school leaders and staff and food service staff can work together to implement? We also would like to explore what is the role or could be the role of SNAP Ed in advocating for these changes. And our data highlight the need to include implementation partner expertise, such as school staff and food service staff when designing interventions for increasing the reach and effectiveness of school meal programs. And again, as Dr. McLaughlin said, No site is exactly the same. They all have different combinations of the different breakfast models. And there did not seem to be one model that worked overall for the entire school all the time. So that makes research on this topic challenging, as our team found out. We also, another key takeaway I didn't write here on the slide, but has affected the way that our team is looking at breakfast at the school district, is based on this research, based on the qualitative findings. We realize what's really important, so what seems to be really important about breakfast is less about breakfast after the bell and cafeteria, and more about, oh, sorry, I said this wrong. It's less about breakfast and the classroom models versus other models, and more about simply finding what works for a school to offer breakfast after the bell instead of before the bell. All right, and then we have some implications for practice for school and food service staff. Again, addressing student tastes, offering hot breakfast and fresh fruit to the extent possible, offering cafeteria after the bell to entire classrooms, because that model maximizes participation while minimizing challenges, integrating instructional time, and cafeteria after the bell makes offering hot breakfast possible and limits messes to one space in the building. And like breakfast in the classroom, cafeteria after the bell addresses student and family needs, such as food insecurity, transportation issues, and other barriers getting to school before school starts. And then in high schools, having students enter the building through the cafeteria maximizes participation by forcing students to opt out instead of opt in. And then for SNAP-Ed staff, and I will pause on this slide and invite some conversation here. So how can SNAP-Ed staff help in ways that are allowable? Can SNAP-Ed expand their role beyond nutrition education and promotion? And so our SNAP-Ed director at the School District of Philadelphia, who our team works closely with on evaluation work, provided some questions for you all to discuss. So she suggested asking, is the kitchen full service or satellite? The satellite is where is the model where there's not a full kitchen, and cafeteria staff simply reheat like prepared items. And what are meal participation rates? Is that public information? What breakfast models are used? Where do students eat? And is the space appealing? Do students enjoy the meals? And is there a share table where students can put unopened items for other students to pick up if they want them? And these are just questions that SNAP-Ed staff can ask school staff in their planning for planning purposes. And then SNAP-Ed staff can potentially also provide some technical assistance and buy-in to implement breakfast after the bell models. They can coordinate with principals and food service staff to mitigate some challenges. As Liz described, sometimes there are communication and coordination challenges that happen at a school, and that might be another place that SNAP-Ed staff might be able to insert themselves and help facilitate. And then again, ensuring communication and clarity around procedures. And so what are other ways that you think that SNAP-Ed staff can potentially help with expanding breakfast participation? We can also take questions about our research now too.
So if it's all right with all of you, I'm gonna just moderate some of the questions coming in. We have a couple of our own. We'll try and keep the conversation going. One person responded, it'd be very helpful if breakfast time was added to school schedule across the country. So time of lesson wouldn't be affected. It could be a standard that kids will eat at school. That way everyone is food secure, not eating will be a personal choice. So I think that comment is really about building in this time for food in a more institutional or regimented way to reduce some of the barriers that you've described.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic idea.
And that brings up for me, what are some of the other kind of institutional measures that a specific school or school district could take to improve access to nutrition for breakfast for their students?
So yeah, I think this, maybe this is a good time to come back around to Dr. McLaughlin and implementation research, because I think one of the key takeaways from all of this is that, again, every school has different challenges. And every school schedule looks different. The facilities are different. What is possible might be different at that school. And so it's really important that we, the team as a whole, thinks really creatively about how to address those problems. So for example, at some sites, it is not possible to increase a hot breakfast because they don't have the facilities to do so. And there's a real cost barrier to that. But there may be other ways in that same site where student tastes and preferences could be addressed. So I don't know, Gabby, if you want to jump in and talk about that, how you plan to help schools address some of these barriers through implementation science.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. McCrossan. So we just had a study funded to basically do just that, and we're using a method called implementation mapping. This is just basically trying to understand what the contextual determinants are within school settings, and then come up with a collaborative way to test out using empirical data if that's going to be effective at increasing participation. So in partnership with the district and so with the Office of Research and the Office of Division of Food Services, we're going to be doing a needs assessment with a small number of schools in the district this fall, one of which I'm talking to this afternoon. So that's exciting to try and understand essentially what's happening, why can we intervene, where are the key barriers, and how can we address some of those problems to really get at some of those context specific issues, because we just see that one size doesn't fit all, and large scale interventions are helpful, but they're just the effects that we see in terms of implementation, and then student outcomes are not really equitable, because again, we're sort of assuming everyone else could just make fresh, smoothies and hot breakfast items. That is not the case. It just puts marginalized populations out of reach, unfortunately. So yes, we'll be starting to research, and we're really excited to get going with that and to share as things progress.
Awesome. There's a few more comments coming into the chat, which I will share. One question is there a way to send home breakfast with students to be able to eat before they get to school, like the weekend backpack program, which also makes me think maybe that there is a way to implement or blend some of these models to kind of address different people's different needs.
I have never heard of that before, but I think it's a great idea.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you for that question, Rebecca. We have another question here, which I think you addressed a little bit, but maybe it'd be helpful to reiterate it. How should SNAP Ed nutrition educators coordinate with principals and food service staff to mitigate some of these challenges?
Yeah, and I think this can be a really good policy systems and environmental, that's what SNAP Ed calls it, change. And I think the first step would be for nutrition educators to take some of this research about how breakfast after the bell is what is going to increase breakfast access and participation. So the question really is going to a principal and finding out maybe what the barriers are. Are principals aware of this research, right, that says this, and how important the issue is? So kind of gaining some of that buy-in, coming in with some statistics or facts about food insecurity in their particular school or city, and how breakfast after the bell is really the best way to address that. So gaining some buy-in, and then finding out what the barriers are from food service staff, from teachers, maybe just talking to as many people in the school as possible, and then just working with the principal on figuring out what they want to do and how they want to address it. I don't know if anybody else has other ideas.
At one of our schools, whenever there was a change to breakfast procedures, and then just like regularly throughout the year to keep everybody on the same page. The principal would have meetings with school staff and with cafeteria staff. So I think the nutrition educators could push for those or be present at those just to help get having everyone on the same page, but then also to reinforce to teachers the importance of breakfast and how a healthy breakfast can change their students' behavior and ability to learn throughout the school day.
Yeah, and I think just being that advocate and just kind of keeping it top of mind for people, every once in a while checking in and saying, hey, remember we had this conversation about how important breakfast after the bell is. Have you thought about X, Y, or Z? Or how can I help you, figure out how to do this?
And we did not include this finding in the slideshow, but it's in our article. Teachers expressed that food tastings that nutrition educators were giving in classrooms as part of their lessons were instrumental in just getting kids more open about foods. And then they were more willing to try new breakfast foods that they were served in the cafeteria.
That's really great. And I think that finding really shows how SNAP-Ed can really lay the groundwork for expanding some of these programs, maybe adjacent to, but outside of SNAP-Ed. One person commented, love the idea that access to breakfast is increased by having students entering through the cafeteria. That one really jumped out at me as well. But in high schools, at least in Philadelphia, all students must pass through metal detectors located at the main entrances. How will this work? And maybe this is getting at a blended model where it's on a cart, or maybe, but maybe that's still an opt-in, which I think your research showed that the opting out was a more effective way to have people participate.
Yeah, the schools where we saw this happening, they actually moved the metal detectors to the cafeteria. So they had a cafeteria that had doors to the exterior. They moved the metal detectors to be right. So as students enter from their exterior door, they're going through the metal detector. And then they kind of funneled them through in such a way that they had to kind of pass by the kitchen, I don't know what you call it, like the little window into the kitchen that, where breakfast is being served. So they had to kind of pass by it and decide whether to take it or not. So it was being shoved in their face. Other schools that I've been in, maybe not part of the study, I can't remember, will maybe just move a breakfast cart right after the metal detectors. And so that's another way to do it. So it kind of depends again on the physical space and the facilities that are available. And also the staffing that is available. So a breakfast cart that is outside of the cafeteria obviously will be another staff member would have to be able to be present to man the cart. So again, it just kind of depends. It's about problem solving for particular schools context and needs. But yes, that we did see the metal detectors. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And that actually brings up another question that we had, which was obviously each school is a little bit different facilities, different staffing, different rules. And of course, between school districts, there's going to be some variation as well. And so I guess, could you speak about some of those differences you touched on a little bit, but some of those differences between the different schools and maybe what insights that gives you for maybe comparing the Philadelphia school district to a more rural school district, and if the challenges are different for those populations and accessing these school breakfast programs.
I don't know that I can answer about other school districts because I have not observed any other ones besides Philadelphia.
That's fair enough.
But I will say, I think school size probably has a lot to do with it. So at a larger school, there may be more staff members available to be more flexible. And that might be a real challenge for a small school. If they only have one kitchen staff, for example, they might not be able to be as flexible. And that might require some significant buy-in on a principal's part, or even teachers to try to kind of jump in and maybe take some of the burden off of that food service staff, or to allot more of a budget to food service to be able to be more flexible. So I would say that the school size is what popped into my mind. I don't know if Liz or Gabby, you have any other thoughts?
Yeah, I've worked with, before coming to Philly, I was a postdoc at Iowa State, so I've been to quite a few schools out in Iowa. Kind of the same thing regarding, yes, the smaller school size, therefore you might expect a better ratio, but then also just having fewer folks on hand to help. And I think that while there may be more schools that have a full service, what I've seen is also like the high school will be the full service kitchen for the middle and elementary schools, and it kind of works in that situation with a small town and one school for each level. And so maybe there's more coordination and cooperation, but there's still that every school has a full kitchen, even though you're out in more spread out areas. So I think the same barriers exist, but the way they present themselves are different, if that makes sense, but just from what I've seen as well.
Yeah, and I'll just add, there's so much variation in our school district that we saw some really creative models for getting everyone breakfast. So for example, one school couldn't fit all of the students in their cafeteria, so they set up an eating space in like a larger multi-purpose room and had a cart there for students to eat. Some schools did split models where certain classes got breakfast in the classroom and others were eating in the cafeteria after the bell. So I think that there's a lot of ways to combine different models to meet a school's unique needs based on their size, or whether they do have a full kitchen in their building. And we even have schools that will have a school building with a full kitchen and then an annex that has a satellite kitchen. So we'll see cafeteria after the bell in the main building, and then breakfast in the classroom in the annex, because those foods are better served in carts, whereas a full kitchen, you might want to be eating in the cafeteria at a table with a hot meal.
And among the variation between these different schools that you looked at, was there any element captured in your research about, I guess, like the demographic differences of the schools? You mentioned size, but maybe like household income, distance that students travel to the school, maybe ethnic or racial demographics. Were any of those possible factors in maybe some of these different models? And then I guess maybe part of that question also is there a cultural appropriateness element to either the way that breakfast is served or the actual food that is being served? Or is that part maybe just standardized through the school district?
Well, I will say, as far as income, we limited our sample to very high poverty schools because we wanted to really focus on the barriers for those specific schools. So I don't think we saw much variation in terms of income between the schools. I don't think we really were able to look at other types of like demographic groupings, but other research that we've done, we have tried to look at that. Liz, do you have anything to add?
I just want to touch on your point about distance to school. So most of the schools, all of the schools that we looked at serve students within like a very close surrounding area to the school. However, high schools typically, are pulling from a larger geographical area. So those students are traveling farther to school and maybe taking public transportation. And then that coupled with early start times, I think it is really difficult for high schools to get their students there to be eating breakfast. So I think that's a major consideration in like thinking about what's going to draw students to get there early, but then knowing how hard it is to get there early, providing second chances like after the bell breakfasts to enable them to eat. I think that's really important. And we do have the demographics of each school site laid out in the article if anyone wants to look at that more closely. And then each school site, the findings are, we refer back to which school site we found or observed each thing we mentioned at, so you can take a look that way.
I would hesitate to draw any sort of generalized conclusions from, about race or anything like that. But yeah, I agree with what Liz said. Yeah, and we do see in our quantitative analyses, we do see much lower participation, like breakfast participation amongst high school students.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really helpful. And I apologize, I haven't dug into the research paper itself. So I'm coming at from a place a little bit of ignorance, but thank you for explaining that. I just have kind of like a wrap-up question. We're approaching the end of our time. And so I'm curious, what are your next steps? What are your next questions? And if you can continue this research, what would you like to focus on next, or is there an area to zoom in on even further?
Well, one thing I wanted to, there's a comment in the chat about educating school staff on how opinions about school meals passes on to the students. And I think what that comment is getting at is a stigma issue, which has come up. We have seen this. It didn't really come up in this study as much, but in other conversations that we've had with other people in the district, there is a real concern that some staff members are repeating negative ideas about the school meals, and that does pass on to students. And I think that's something that we're really hoping that Dr. McLaughlin can also tease out in the next phase of her research, is really looking at stigma. And that's also, I think, a place where SNAP Ed could make a real difference, is in working with school staff around the stigma issues. So Gabby, do you want to jump in?
Yes. So basically this was like really our first County Cage Temple, 2 years ago. So it's like our first collaborative project to see where the research needs were at the district. And then from there, we wanted to sort of explore how we could actually build on what we already know and then do some really intricate mixed methods research to help understand where would be best to intervene, how we can engage our end users, so our students, our caregivers and teachers, admin and food service, to basically collaboratively come up with a means to test something, whether it be a real discrete intervention or a more sort of multifaceted strategy to help us understand how we can improve school meals in these settings. So that's what the next 5 years are going to be, basically. So we'll see how that goes. The first step, like I said, is that needs assessment, because I feel this is one of the only research studies that has looked at these issues, but we still aren't looking at students. We still aren't asking them for their perceptions, and we still aren't involved in the process of research. And that to me is, there are definitely more hoops to jump through. And I think as well, because of the constraints of the Office of Research with time, it's just, I think this is a huge undertaking. But so hopefully now, when we actually ask students and caregivers amongst other participant groups, will we hopefully arrive at some hopefully promising solutions. But I love these ideas in the chat too, and these are potential things that we could test. So nothing is off the table, but we have to just make sure that we're doing it and doing right by our participants and people that are actually going to be experiencing and receiving these meals. So
yeah,
one more, sorry to jump in because I know we're about to end, but we have one more slide from our nutrition director suggesting potentially a challenge that SNAP Ed faces, that in the toolkit there are few interventions that provide strategies for system changes around school meals, but some of the pairs changes adopted languages here that she was sort of suggesting might be able to fit in for SNAP Ed staff to do this kind of advocacy and this technical assistance around increasing meals. So just wanted to throw that out there.
Awesome. Thank you very much. And thank you, Dr. McLaughlin, for really bringing it back to the people that we serve, and that being the why any of us show up. So so thank you for that reframing. With that, I think we can start to wrap it up. Really, thank you very much to our presenters. This was a really insightful and challenging and wonderful presentation. So really thank you for sharing your work and taking the time to meet with all of us today. There will be this recording will be available on our website, panen.org/webinars, where you'll be able to watch this again and again. It is worth 1 continuing education credit. And there will also be a survey going out. I believe it is in the chat, but it will also go to your email tomorrow. So so keep an eye out for that. We really appreciate your feedback, which we will share with the presenters, and it really helps PANEN steer programming for the rest of this fiscal year and coming years as well. So please, we look forward to that feedback. With that, really thank you everybody for participating, for your thoughtful comments and questions. Any other feedback, you're welcome to email our staff. And please come to the next webinar. Currently not scheduled, but we will let you know when that is coming down the line. And so you can continue to join us for our webinar series.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, thank you. And have a great day, everybody. We've reached the hour. Have a good rest of your day.